The long and difficult life of 70-year-old Marilyn was an example of fortitude, wisdom, and the ability of a person to cope with all the blows of fate. She lived in a small, quiet town in the southern United States where everyone knew each other, and rumors spread faster than a fire in dry grass. Despite her age, Marilyn remained an energetic and well-groomed woman who always attracted attention with her youthful spirit and open soul. She often helped her neighbors, kept in touch with her friends, and it would seem her life was full and rich. But the fire in her soul had long since died. After the death of her husband more than 20 years ago, she resigned herself to loneliness, devoting all her efforts to raising her only daughter, Rebecca. Marilyn was proud of Rebecca, who had grown into an intelligent and successful woman. Rebecca had an active social life, and despite the fact that her personal relationships were not always successful, she found solace in her hobbies and work. For Marilyn, this was enough. She believed that her mission in life had been accomplished. Her daughter was settled, her grandchildren were growing up, and she did not need anything else. She was content with a measured life in her home, surrounded by memories of the past, spending evenings alone looking at old photographs and thinking about years long gone. However, everything changed when a young man named Jason appeared in her house. He was only 19 years old, and he was Rebecca's boyfriend. Jason brought something new to Marilyn's house: freshness, youth, and energy. He often came to Rebecca's, sometimes stayed for lunch or dinner, and soon began to communicate more with Marilyn. Their conversations began with simple topics. He asked her questions about the past, was interested in her life and family history. Marilyn was flattered by the young man's attention. He was not just a polite young man. He listened to her stories with interest and respect, which she had not felt for a long time. This interest was an unexpected but pleasant discovery for her. As time went on, Jason began to visit more often. His time with Rebecca gradually decreased, but his time with Marilyn increased. He found something special in her, something that was missing in his relationship with her daughter. She was a wise, experienced woman who had seen life and been through a lot. Jason admired her inner strength and the way she dealt with difficulties. He began to see her not as his girlfriend's mother, but as a woman he was increasingly drawn to. For Marilyn, it was like a breath of fresh air. She couldn't believe that a young, handsome guy could be interested in her. This interest revived in her something that she had long buried under the weight of the years: her femininity, her desire to be loved and needed. She began to catch herself waiting for him to come home, that her heart skipped a beat when he crossed the threshold of the house, and that she thought about him more and more often. Their conversations became more and more personal, and soon Jason began to share with her his thoughts and feelings that he could not tell anyone else, not even Rebecca. A special connection arose between them, a connection that violated all boundaries of decency and morality, but was so strong that they could not resist it. These encounters were a mutual salvation. For Jason, Marilyn became someone he could come to for support and understanding. She did not judge him, did not demand anything from him except his presence. For her, Jason was something new and forbidden, but that was what made their connection so attractive. Marilyn knew she could not offer him youth and a future, but she could not stop the feelings that were developing. With each passing day, their relationship became more and more complicated. Secret glances, casual touches, seemingly innocent compliments. All of this grew into something more than just friendship between an older woman and a younger guy. The passion that was born between them became the force that changed their lives forever. Marilyn realized that what was happening between them was wrong, but she could not stop. Jason, despite his young age, was also captivated by this connection. He understood that this could destroy his relationship with Rebecca, but he could not tear himself away from Marilyn. Thus began their dangerous and forbidden game, which they both knew could not end well. After the first cautious steps, their relationship began to develop rapidly. Marilyn became more and more attached to Jason every day, who became for her a symbol of long-lost youth and vitality. His presence in her home brought her a joy that she had not experienced for a long time. However, beneath this superficial joy, there was a deep internal struggle. She knew that what was happening between them was wrong. Her mind tried to fight these feelings, but her heart said something completely different. For Jason, the relationship with Marilyn was also something new and unexpected. At first, it all seemed like a simple game to him. The young man was interested in finding out how far he could go, being carried away by a woman who was old enough to be his grandmother. He liked the way Marilyn listened to him, the way her eyes sparkled when he talked about his youthful dreams and ambitions. She gave him the emotional support and attention that he did not find in his relationship with Rebecca. And although Rebecca was his peer and they seemed to be suitable for each other, Jason began to feel that there was something much deeper connecting him with Marilyn. It was at this time that their first truly dangerous feelings began to emerge. At first, these were innocent conversations, then lingering glances, light but noticeable touches. Jason began to visit Marilyn not only when Rebecca was home, but also in her absence. He found various excuses to be alone with her, and these meetings became increasingly intimate. Marilyn felt that she was losing control of her emotions. She understood that this was not just flirting with a young guy. She began to have real feelings for him, such as she had not felt for many years. Her heart, which had been dormant for a long time, suddenly began to beat with renewed vigor. Jason became for her not just a young friend of her daughter, but someone much more. Every time he came, she prepared for the meeting with him, trying to look better than usual. She began to care about her appearance again, buying new clothes, experimenting with makeup, despite her 70 years. She felt that she was blossoming again, although she realized the absurdity of what was happening. However, the deeper Marilyn got into this relationship, the more fear gripped her. She understood that Jason, being young and energetic, would sooner or later realize that she would not be able to give him what he wanted from life. She knew that she could not compete with young girls like her daughter Rebecca, and although Jason gave her signs of attention, she still felt on edge. An internal conflict was tearing her apart from the inside. On the one hand, she could not resist her feelings for him, and on the other she understood that their romance had no future. Meanwhile, Jason, although enjoying their interactions, also began to realize that the situation was becoming more serious than he had initially thought. He saw that Marilyn was becoming more and more attached to him, and it was beginning to frighten him. He did not know how to get out of this situation without hurting her. He could no longer treat this relationship as a simple flirtation or a fleeting affair. Everything had become too serious, and the consequences of his actions were slowly looming over him like a black cloud before a storm. It was at this moment that a turning point occurred in their relationship. One evening, when they were alone again, Marilyn made the first move that changed everything. She could no longer hide her feelings and, despite her inner inhibitions, confessed her love to Jason. It was a bold but extremely desperate confession. She understood that her words could ruin everything, but she could no longer hold back. For her, this was the moment of truth when she decided that she had to find out how he felt. Jason was stunned by her confession. He knew their relationship had gone too far, but he hadn't expected it to turn so abruptly. His mind told him he should leave immediately, that this relationship was destructive for both of them, but his heart wavered. In that moment, he saw before him not just an older woman, but a person who truly loved him, despite all the obstacles. Marilyn had opened up to him completely, and he felt he couldn't reject her. Jason's answer was unexpected even for himself. He told Marilyn that he had feelings for her too. It was not just a polite agreement. At that moment, he realized that he himself was no longer able to break their connection. His confession became what finally tied their destinies. Now they both realized that they were at the point of no return. After this event, their relationship began to develop at an even faster rate. They began to spend more and more time together, even when Rebecca was at home. Their secret glances and touches became even more frequent and bold. Every time they were alone, a passion flared up between them that they could no longer hide. It was that same forbidden connection that they both knew about, but could not resist. Marilyn, under the influence of this new love, began to make plans for the future. She thought that perhaps their relationship could last longer than she had initially thought. She hoped that Jason would stay with her despite their age difference. But with each passing day, her fears only grew stronger. She saw that Jason was young and his affection for her could be temporary. This fear of losing him became almost obsessive for her. Thus began the birth of their forbidden feelings, which, despite their strength, carried within them the germ of destruction. It was clear to both that this passion would lead to disaster, but they could no longer stop. As the relationship between Marilyn and Jason deepened, tensions began to build in the house that Rebecca couldn't help but notice. Her initial suspicions were as subtle as the rustling of leaves, but over time they began to intensify, turning into real storms of doubt. She couldn't understand why her young boyfriend had suddenly started showing such an interest in her mother, or why Jason himself had started spending more time with Marilyn than with her. Rebecca always considered her mother a strong and independent woman who managed to raise her after her father's death. Despite their close relationship, Rebecca could not help but notice strange changes in Marilyn's behavior. She often caught her smiling to herself, as if remembering something pleasant. Marilyn began to spend more time in front of the mirror, choosing outfits, although she had never paid much attention to this before. She suddenly began to buy expensive creams and perfumes that she used in her youth, and this caused Rebecca surprise and bewilderment. From time to time, Rebecca heard her mother make strange comments about life, about love, about how age is just a number. These conversations were unusual for Marilyn, who always tried to talk about real problems and not to dwell on the clouds. All this made Rebecca think about what was really going on. But the most alarming thing for her was the sudden change in Jason's behavior. Jason began to distance himself from Rebecca. If they used to spend a lot of time together, now he increasingly found excuses not to meet with her. He became less attentive, stopped giving compliments, which used to be a common thing. Jason often said that he had a lot of things to do and that he needed to help Marilyn with something around the house, which seemed strange to Rebecca because her mother always managed on her own. Rebecca, like every woman, felt a change in the relationship. She couldn't clearly formulate her suspicions, but the feeling that something was wrong grew with each passing day. She began to wonder, had Jason found someone else, or had his interest in her simply faded? But who could it be? Her thoughts raced until she began to notice more and more strange behavior in his behavior. One evening, when Rebecca decided to return home earlier than usual, she saw that the door to the house was slightly open. At first, she did not pay attention to it, thinking that someone simply forgot to close it. But when she entered the house, something unexpected awaited her. She heard quiet voices coming from the kitchen. Rebecca came closer and froze in place when she realized that these were the voices of her mother and Jason. They were talking too close, too intimately, and though the words were not revealing, the tone gave them away. Rebecca felt fear rising in her heart and decided to leave the house quietly, so as not to be noticed. Her suspicions were becoming more and more clear. That evening, Rebecca thought long and hard about what she had just seen and heard. She couldn't believe that her own mother would do something like that to her boyfriend. It seemed absurd and impossible. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there really was something between them. It was all she could think about, and it was beginning to seriously affect her relationship with Jason. The next few days were a real test for Rebecca. She watched every move her mother and Jason made, trying to catch even the slightest sign of their connection. She noticed how they glanced at each other, how Marilyn sometimes lingered in the kitchen when Jason came in for a drink of water or a snack. Rebecca tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but her intuition told her otherwise. And even though she didn't know the whole truth yet, shadows of suspicion began to cover her mind, giving rise to feelings of jealousy and betrayal. She wanted to talk to Jason directly, but what could she tell him? After all, she had no proof, only vague suspicions. She was also afraid to broach the subject with her mother because they had always been close, and such an accusation could ruin their relationship forever. Meanwhile, Jason began to notice that Rebecca was acting strangely. She began asking more questions about where he was spending his time and why he was helping her mother so often. He sensed that she was suspicious, but he tried not to show his concern. Jason knew that his relationship with Marilyn had already gone too far, and that exposure was inevitable. But he still hoped to avoid that moment. And so the clouds began to gather over this forbidden relationship. Rebecca could no longer ignore the growing suspicions, and her distrust gradually turned into the certainty that something more was going on between her mother and Jason than just friendly communication. After Marilyn and Jason's relationship had reached a new level, their communication became even more secretive and tense. They now realized that their feelings for each other were not just a crush or a passing fancy. Their connection was deep and emotionally charged, but that also made it dangerous and destructive. They knew that if their affair were discovered, the consequences would be disastrous for everyone, especially Rebecca. Secret meetings became their only chance to continue their relationship. They began looking for any chance to be alone, but with each passing day it became more and more difficult. Rebecca sensed that something was going on between her mother and Jason, and her suspicions grew. At times, she stayed home longer than usual, as if testing them, and sometimes asked questions that seemed too direct. Marilyn and Jason knew they had to be careful not to give themselves away. Some of the most intense moments for them were quiet, almost imperceptible conversations in the kitchen or garden when Rebecca left the house. Jason found excuses to go to Marilyn when her daughter was at work or at the store. These meetings were filled with anxiety and passion. Every time they were alone, the fear of exposure beat in their hearts, which only fueled their feelings. Ordinary everyday moments, drinking tea together or talking about everyday matters, hid the depth of their secret passion. Marilyn, despite her age and many years of life experience, felt like a young girl, immersed in a whirlpool of emotions. She understood that this affair could not last forever, but she could not stop. Every time Jason came, her heart sank. She knew that she was drawn to him more and more. A young guy who admired her, listened to her, and was there for her made her feel alive again. Jason, in turn, was torn between his passion for Marilyn and his guilt towards Rebecca. He became increasingly entangled in his emotions. At times, he wondered how far their relationship had gone and what he should do to end the affair. But every time he was alone with Marilyn, all his doubts disappeared. Passion and desire outweighed reason, and he allowed himself to continue seeing her despite the knowledge that it was wrong. One of the most memorable moments of their secret meetings was the evening when Rebecca went to another city for work for a few days. This gave Marilyn and Jason the opportunity to spend time together without the fear of being caught. They enjoyed this time as if it was their last chance to be together. Marilyn cooked dinner, and they spent the evening talking and laughing as if there was no danger. But deep down, they both knew it was just an illusion. When the night had enveloped the house in darkness and silence reigned all around, Jason stayed with Marilyn longer than usual. They sat in the kitchen by the light of a small lamp. Their conversations gradually died down, and tension hung between them. At that moment, Jason came closer, and their eyes met. The silence became unbearably loud, and in a moment their hands intertwined in a secret rush of passion. It was one of those moments when reality retreated and only their emotions took its place. But this peace was only temporary. That night, when Jason left and Marilyn was alone, she realized how dangerous their relationship had become. She knew that if anyone found out about their affair, it would destroy her relationship with her daughter and change Jason's life forever. But despite this realization, she couldn't stop her feelings. After that night, their meetings became even more secretive. Marilyn and Jason tried to avoid any situation where they could give themselves away, but the more they tried, the harder it became. Every touch, every look was filled with tension, and this made their relationship even more confusing and risky. The secret they kept became heavier and threatened to destroy everything they had before. So their romance turned into a real trap. Passion and fear went hand in hand, and their secret meetings were like playing with fire, where any mistake could lead to disaster. As time went on, despite all the passion and excitement that surrounded their relationship, cracks began to appear between Marilyn and Jason. The secret meetings became more intense, and the pressure of hiding their affair grew with each passing week. The sense of danger that had initially fueled their passion gradually became a weight that weighed them both down, and that weight soon became unbearable. At some point, Jason began to have doubts. He realized that their relationship, which had seemed like such an exciting adventure, was now a trap. At first, it all seemed like an innocent infatuation, but now the relationship with Marilyn began to threaten his normal life. He became increasingly frustrated. Jason realized that he was attracted to a woman old enough to be his grandmother, but this not only jeopardized his future with Rebecca, but also destroyed his own sense of normality. Marilyn, for her part, felt his distance. She began to notice that Jason was coming less often, his visits were becoming shorter, and his conversations were becoming colder and more superficial. Her heart was breaking with pain, and she could not understand why their relationship was fading so quickly. After all, just recently, everything had seemed so bright and exciting. Every day that Jason did not come, Marilyn felt a wave of fear and jealousy. She was afraid that he would get close to her daughter again, that he was just using her as a passing amusement, and now he was going back to Rebecca. One evening, when Jason finally showed up, the atmosphere was tense from the start. They met at Marilyn's house as usual when Rebecca was at work. However, this visit was different. The air was heavy with unspoken words and the tension that had been building for weeks. Marilyn could no longer contain her feelings and asked Jason directly, "What's going on? You don't want to be with me anymore?" Her voice was shaking and there were tears in her eyes. She looked broken and vulnerable. Jason, who was trying to remain calm, felt his anger and frustration begin to build. He knew he couldn't go on like this, but he found it hard to admit to himself and Marilyn that their relationship was no longer bringing him joy, only pain and worry. Jason responded coldly that they needed to cool off a bit and think about what they were doing. This was the first time he had spoken openly about their relationship becoming a problem. He said that their relationship could no longer continue as it was, that it was too risky and unsafe for both of them. He also mentioned that they had gone too far and that it was starting to ruin his life and his relationship with Rebecca. Marilyn couldn't believe her ears. All her fears were coming true at that moment. Her heart was broken. She felt betrayed and abandoned. The same questions were ringing in her head. How could he give up on her so easily? How could he question something that was so real and important to her? She began to raise her voice, accusing Jason of simply using her for his whims, that she was just a toy for him, a temporary toy that could now be thrown away. Jason, trying to remain calm, said that it was not so, that he was confused too, but their relationship could not continue. He tried to explain that he felt great guilt towards Rebecca and that it was beginning to destroy his inner world. However, Marilyn was too absorbed in her emotions to listen to him. A storm was raging in her heart. She could not accept the fact that Jason was going to leave her. The conversation turned into a full-blown argument. The words became increasingly harsh and the tone increasingly tense. Jason tried to walk away to avoid escalation, but Marilyn held him back, insisting that they had to talk it through to the end. She said that if he left now, it would mean the end of everything between them, and she could no longer live with it. This first quarrel between them became a turning point in their relationship. It showed how deep the crisis was brewing between them. Now their relationship no longer seemed to them the romantic utopia it had been at the beginning. The mystery and danger that had previously fueled their feelings began to destroy them from within. Jason saw that he could no longer stay with Marilyn, but at the same time, he did not want to hurt her. And Marilyn, realizing that she was losing him, began to feel despair, which only increased her desire to keep Jason at any cost. And although Jason stayed this time to finish the conversation, the air was thick with the knowledge that their relationship was ending. The argument was the beginning of the end, and from then on their meetings were marked not only by passion, but also by pain, uncertainty, and fear of what would happen next. After their first serious argument, the relationship between Marilyn and Jason began to slowly but inexorably fall apart. The tension grew with each passing day, and they both felt it. Marilyn, immersed in her feelings, now lived in constant fear and jealousy. Her heart, which had not known love for many years, was in the grip of this destructive emotion, like a fire consuming everything in its path. Jealousy became a constant companion in her life. Every time Jason didn't answer her calls or came less often than before, her thoughts began to race. She imagined him returning to Rebecca, spending time with her, laughing and hugging her. These images haunted her, tormented her, and poisoned her every day. Marilyn couldn't get rid of them, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that their relationship was real, and her fears were nothing more than a figment of her imagination. Over time, her jealousy became more obsessive. She began asking Jason more and more questions about where he had been and who he had been with. She wanted to know his every move, and any evasive explanation would cause her to feel a new wave of anxiety. Marilyn felt like she was losing control of the situation. Her once calm and orderly life had become a constant whirlwind of emotions and fear of losing Jason. Jason, for his part, was increasingly distant from her. He felt that their relationship had become too intense and demanding, whereas before he had thought that their secret affair was something exciting and even romantic, now he increasingly found himself thinking that it had become a burden. He did not know how to cope with her obsessive jealousy and constant suspicions, and this only deepened his sense of guilt towards Rebecca. He began to visit Marilyn's house less and less often and spent more time with her daughter, hoping that this would help him return to his former life. But it was precisely this behavior of Jason that only increased Marilyn's jealousy. When she noticed that he began to spend more time with Rebecca, her fears reached their peak. Every time she saw them together, she was overcome with despair. She began to think that Jason was only using her for a fleeting pleasure and that his true feelings had always been for her daughter. This realization tore at her heart and she could not contain her emotions. One day, when Jason canceled his meeting with Marilyn again, she couldn't take it anymore. Her jealousy and pain took over her completely, and without thinking, she went to his house. She wanted to see him, to find out why he was avoiding her. Marilyn was ready to do anything to get answers to her questions, even if it meant she had to risk showing herself. At that moment, she didn't care what people thought of her, or even her own daughter. When she got to Jason's house, she saw Rebecca's car parked outside his house. That was the last straw. A fire of rage and jealousy blazed inside her that she couldn't control. Marilyn knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like something irreparable was about to happen. Jason opened the door, and his surprise was noticeable. He did not expect to see Marilyn on the threshold of his house. Rebecca was inside, unaware that something was going on between her mother and her boyfriend. Jason tried to remain calm, but Marilyn could no longer contain her emotions. She began to demand explanations, accusing him of betrayal and lies. Her voice was full of despair and pain, and she could not stop, although she understood that her words could destroy everything. Jason, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to talk Marilyn into calming down. He took her outside to avoid Rebecca's attention, but the conversation continued with even greater fury. Marilyn couldn't understand how he could do this to her. She felt humiliated and betrayed. It was like a stab in the back. The man she loved was now spending time with her daughter again, and her fears were being confirmed. This conversation was a turning point in their relationship. Marilyn knew she was losing Jason, and this realization plunged her into an abyss of despair. Her jealousy reached such proportions that she could no longer think rationally. She was willing to do anything to get him back, and her mind began to come up with increasingly desperate ways to keep him close. Her obsessive desire to preserve their connection at any cost became the driving force in her life. With each passing day, Marilyn sank deeper into despair. She could no longer bear to see Jason and Rebecca together, and her jealousy continued to eat away at her from the inside. Jason felt that their relationship had finally fallen apart. He knew that this could not continue, but he did not know how to break the bond without causing Marilyn even more pain. Thus began the final stage of their forbidden relationship, the stage when jealousy and despair took over all their communication, making any way back impossible. The relationship between Marilyn and Jason began to finally disintegrate under the weight of jealousy, tension, and disappointment. Their dialogues no longer had the same ease and passion. More and more often, their meetings turned into heated quarrels, accompanied by mutual accusations and bitterness. For Marilyn, this was a real nightmare. She realized that their connection, which she treasured so much, was gradually disappearing, but she could not come to terms with it. Jealousy was eating her up from the inside. Every time Jason met Rebecca, Marilyn felt like she was being hit by a blow to her self-esteem. She felt helpless in the face of an inevitable breakup and tried to do everything she could to keep Jason close, but her actions only made things worse. Jason became more and more distant, and his patience was wearing thin. He wanted to get out of this relationship, which had become unbearable for him, but he didn't know how to do it without serious consequences. One evening, Marilyn decided it was time to take more decisive action. She realized that if she didn't do something drastic, she would lose Jason forever. She tried to convince him that they could save their relationship, that everything could still be saved. But Jason, tired of constant quarrels, no longer believed in it. His thoughts increasingly turned to the fact that it was time to put an end to their secret affair, which had gotten out of control. Marilyn invited Jason to her home for a heart-to-heart talk. She wanted this to be their last attempt to sort out their relationship and decide what to do next. When he arrived, the atmosphere was tense from the start. Marilyn seemed excited and nervous while Jason was withdrawn and silent. He knew this conversation would be a turning point for both of them. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Marilyn began the conversation with confessions. She told him again how much she loved him, how he had changed her life, and how she could not live without him. Her voice trembled with emotion, and she could no longer hold back her tears. She begged Jason to give them another chance, assuring him that they could be happy together. But Jason was adamant. He said that their relationship had gone too far and that they both knew it was wrong. He said that he felt guilty towards Rebecca and could no longer live with this lie. He tried to explain that it was best for both of them if they ended the relationship now, before it led to more problems. But to Marilyn, these words sounded like a death sentence. Her pain and despair turned to anger. She felt betrayed by Jason at a time when she needed him most. Marilyn rose from the table, raising her voice, accusing Jason of using her, of playing with her emotions, of never truly loving her. She felt humiliated and rejected, and her rage grew with each passing minute. Jason, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to leave, but Marilyn blocked his way. She couldn't let him just leave. Her anger was so strong that she couldn't think rationally anymore. She continued to accuse him of betraying her, of leaving her for Rebecca, and of ruining her life. A heated argument ensued between them, with neither one wanting to back down. Jason tried to remain calm, but his patience was at its limit. He could no longer bear the accusations and decided that this would be their last meeting. He told Marilyn that he would not return, that their relationship was over and that she needed to accept it. But for Marilyn, these words sounded like a knife to the heart. At that moment, her despair reached its peak. She realized that she was losing him forever, and this thought made her do something she never imagined. In a fit of anger and pain, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy vase on the table, and threw it at Jason. He managed to dodge, but this action clearly showed that the situation had become truly dangerous. Jason, realizing that there was no point in continuing the conversation, left the house, leaving Marilyn in a state of complete emotional collapse. For the first time in their relationship, she realized that he was really leaving, and now she was alone. Her mind was consumed with rage, jealousy, and despair, and she could no longer think straight. She felt that she had lost everything she had, and now her life was empty and worthless. This quarrel was the last straw that destroyed their relationship. Jason was no longer going to return to Marilyn, and she, in turn, was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But there were even more terrible consequences ahead, for which neither of them was prepared. After Jason left that fateful night, Marilyn sank into an even deeper despair. She felt like the world was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do about it. Everything that had seemed to her to be the meaning of life was now disappearing before her eyes. She was left alone in an empty house, overcome with anger and pain. Her thoughts became chaotic, and she could not find a way out of the situation. Every moment she was haunted by the thought that she was losing Jason forever, and her heart was torn apart. The next morning, Marilyn was sitting at her desk as usual, but this time she felt completely drained. Her head was heavy from a sleepless night, and her hands were shaking from the strain. She tried to figure out what to do next, but no plan seemed sufficient. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, and she felt a cold fear run down her spine. This was an unexpected visit. When Marilyn opened the door, Rebecca was standing there. Her daughter's face was serious. Her eyes were determined. She looked like she already knew something important and had come for answers. Marilyn knew immediately that her suspicions were correct. Rebecca had somehow found out about what was going on between her and Jason. This was the moment she had dreaded most, but it was inevitably approaching. Rebecca walked into the house uninvited, and Marilyn felt a cold shiver run down her spine. There was tension in the air. The daughter she loved and had sacrificed so much of her life for was now standing in front of her, waiting for an explanation. Rebecca began the conversation with a direct question. "Mom, what's going on with you and Jason?" Her voice was cold, almost icy. She couldn't stand the uncertainty and lies any longer. Marilyn, overcome with shock and fear, was at a loss for words. She tried to think of an explanation that would make things right, but she knew the truth was too obvious. Rebecca had seen enough, and perhaps even heard or learned of Marilyn and Jason's meetings. There was no point in trying to lie. Marilyn realized that her whole life now depended on how she answered this question. At first she tried to deny everything she could, but Rebecca didn't give her a chance. She became more and more insistent, asking questions one after another. Finally, Marilyn gave in to the pressure. She realized that she could no longer hide the truth, and at that moment, words burst from her lips that became a real confession for her. "Yes, there was something between us." These words sounded like a death sentence. Rebecca recoiled as if she had been struck. Her face went pale and her eyes flashed with disbelief and disgust. She couldn't believe her ears. Her mother, who had always been her role model, was involved in a secret affair with her own boyfriend. The revelation came as a shock to her. Her heart was broken, and the world as she knew it was turned upside down. The revelation came too suddenly and too painfully. Rebecca felt her anger growing with each passing second. Her mother had betrayed her, and Jason, the person she trusted most, had turned out to be a liar. It all seemed like a nightmare from which she could not wake up. She began to scream at Marilyn, accusing her of destroying their family, that now their relationship would never be the same. Tears of rage rolled down her cheeks, and every word she spoke was soaked in pain. Marilyn tried to justify herself, but her words were drowned out by Rebecca's screams. She couldn't find any suitable explanations that would soften the blow, and she knew that she had lost her daughter's trust forever. In that moment, she realized that her life, her relationship with her daughter, and all those years they had spent together would never be the same again. She was facing the destruction of everything she held dear. Meanwhile, Jason, unaware of what was happening in Marilyn's house, continued to live his life, but his inner unrest did not go away. He felt that something had changed since his last meeting with Marilyn, but he didn't know that all this would soon come to light. Rebecca, furious and insulted, left Marilyn's house without saying another word. She decided to deal with Jason personally, and her intentions were clear. She would not let this go unpunished. That evening, when Rebecca met Jason, their conversation was no less heated. She confronted him with the truth, demanding an explanation. Jason was forced to admit his mistakes and confirm her worst fears. This was the final point in their relationship. Rebecca could no longer look at him the same way. She felt betrayed and insulted not only as a woman, but also as a daughter. Thus, their secret affair was revealed, and its consequences were devastating for all involved. Marilyn lost her daughter, Jason lost the trust of both women, and Rebecca lost her faith in her family and her loved one. This day was the beginning of the end, but the most tragic events were yet to come. The revelation of their secret affair shook the lives of everyone involved. For Marilyn, it was a nightmare. Now that the truth had come out, her home was empty and cold. Rebecca had severed all ties with her mother, moved out of the house, and was not even going to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. Jason also stopped visiting Marilyn, fearing further consequences and feeling guilty towards Rebecca. Everything that had once connected them now seemed to be destroyed forever. Marilyn was left alone with her thoughts, completely consumed by guilt, pain, and betrayal. She had lost everything: her relationship with her daughter, her young lover, and most importantly, her self-respect. Her life had become a void, filled only with painful memories of how things once were. Now that she was alone, without Jason and Rebecca, she realized how wrong she had been in hoping that their relationship could have a future. But along with despair came other feelings: anger and resentment. At some point, Marilyn realized that her life was ruined not only because of her own actions, but also because of Jason, who first gave her hope and then abandoned her at the most difficult moment. She began to blame him for what happened. Her love for him gradually began to turn into hatred, mixed with a sense of betrayal. The realization grew in her head that Jason may never have truly loved her, that it was all just a game, and now she had paid too high a price for this game. One evening, as Marilyn sat in her dark living room surrounded by silence and emptiness, her anger reached its peak. She began to remember all the times Jason had lied to her, when he had promised to stay with her and then pulled away. These thoughts were literally burning her inside. Her mind could no longer cope with the growing sense of injustice. Marilyn realized that she could no longer live with this feeling of betrayal. She felt that she had to do something to regain control of her life. At that moment, her emotions got out of control. In a fit of rage and despair, she grabbed the phone and dialed Jason's number. His voice on the other side of the line was calm and seemed indifferent, which made her even more angry. Marilyn could not contain her feelings and poured out all the pain that had accumulated over the past weeks on him. She accused him of ruining her life, that because of him she lost everything that was dear to her. Jason tried to talk to her calmly, but her screams drowned out his words. He realized that their conversation was pointless and decided to hang up, but this only added fuel to the fire. Marilyn felt that now she was finally alone, that even the man with whom she shared her love and passion now refused to listen to her. This last gesture of Jason, his indifference and attempt to avoid the conversation, exploded her emotions. She couldn't accept that it had ended this way. Images of Rebecca and Jason flashed through her mind, how they could have a life together, how he would probably return to her daughter and she would be left abandoned and alone. It was unbearable for her. Her jealousy and betrayal clouded her mind. She was unable to think rationally. The only thought that ran through her head was that she had to do something to stop this pain, to regain some control over her life. Marilyn made a decision that would be fatal for everyone involved. She couldn't let Jason just walk away without paying for everything he had done. She felt like this would be her last attempt to change anything in her life. Her love for him had turned to hate, and she couldn't hold back these destructive feelings any longer. That night, after talking on the phone, Marilyn made the decision to confront Jason. She wanted to make him realize how much pain he had caused her. In her mind, it was clear that she couldn't let him walk away like that, not after everything that had happened. She hoped that this meeting would change everything and give her back the sense of control she had been losing for so long. This decision was the beginning of a chain of events that led to tragic consequences. The destructive power of her emotions, accumulated over these weeks, pushed her to actions that no one could have predicted. On the night Marilyn made her fateful decision, her mind was completely clouded by anger, jealousy, and despair. She could think of nothing but how to make Jason pay for his betrayal. She no longer saw him as the young man who had once ignited her passion. Now, in her mind's eye, there was only the image of the man who had ruined her life and left her alone in this world. Marilyn put on her best dress, as if she were getting ready for an important meeting, and headed to Jason's house. Conflicting emotions were boiling inside her, love that turned into hate, and passion that turned into jealousy. She thought that this evening should be the moment when everything would change. Her heart was full of determination. Her mind was consumed with the desire to put an end to this painful story. When she arrived at Jason's house, it was dark and quiet. He lived alone, which only made her plan easier. Marilyn knocked on the door, and Jason opened it, surprised by her sudden appearance. He hadn't expected to see Marilyn after that heated conversation on the phone. His face was a mixture of tiredness and irritation, but he let her in anyway, determined to hear what she had to say. Marilyn walked inside, and the atmosphere immediately became heavy. She started to speak, but her words were full of anger and pain. She began to accuse Jason again of betraying her, ruining her life and leaving her alone. She could not hold back her tears, and her voice became more and more desperate with each word. Jason tried to stop her, trying to convince her that it was over, that there could be nothing more between them. But for Marilyn, these words were like a knife in the heart. At some point, her rage crossed the line. She saw a knife lying next to a plate on the kitchen table. In a fit of anger and despair, she grabbed it. It was the moment when reason finally gave way to destructive emotions. Everything happened as if in a fog. She did not think about the consequences, did not realize what she was doing. The only thing that moved her was the desire to end this pain once and for all. Jason, seeing the knife in her hands, tried to stop her, but it all happened too fast. Marilyn stabbed, and the knife sank deep into his body. He staggered back, clutching at the wound, his eyes filled with surprise and fear. He couldn't believe it had come to this. Jason collapsed to the floor, his breathing ragged, and blood quickly filled the space around him. Marilyn, realizing what she had just done, froze in place. Her hands were still clutching the knife, which was now covered in blood. She looked at Jason lying on the floor, unable to believe that she had just killed him. Thoughts began to spin in her head. How did this happen? What did I do? Fear and horror washed over her. Her body began to shake and she dropped the knife. The room was deathly silent. The only sounds Marilyn could hear were her own rapid breathing and Jason's muffled groans. She went to him, but it was too late. Jason was dying. His eyes were fading and the last of his strength was leaving his body. Marilyn knelt down next to him, desperately trying to do something to fix the situation, but she already knew that nothing could bring him back to life. Minutes passed like hours, and when Jason finally took his last breath, Marilyn realized that she had just committed murder. She had killed the man she had once loved. The realization washed over her in a wave of horror and remorse. The anger that had controlled her actions for so long evaporated, leaving only emptiness in its wake. Marilyn sat on the floor next to Jason's body, unable to move. Her life was now completely destroyed. She had lost everything: love, her daughter's respect, her freedom. She was a murderer now. All her attempts to regain control of her life had led to disaster. All that was left was the horror and remorse that would haunt her for the rest of her life. That night changed Marilyn's life forever. Now she had to face the consequences of her actions, but deep down she already knew that no punishment could compare to what she would experience every day, remembering this moment when her emotions took over and she did something irreparable. Thus ended the story of their forbidden passion, a story that began with love, turned into jealousy, and ultimately ended in tragedy. But this tragedy was only the beginning of what lay ahead for Marilyn in her new reality, a reality where she would meet justice and loneliness. After Jason took his last breath, the silence that filled the house became unbearably heavy for Marilyn. Her mind was in panic. She sat next to his body, trying to comprehend what had happened, but every minute only increased her horror. Her hands were shaking, her heart was pounding, and her thoughts were confused in a jumble of questions. What to do now? How to hide this? Where to run? Marilyn couldn't stay in the house where a murder had just happened. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out. She tried to pull herself together, but panic had taken hold of her so much that she couldn't think clearly. She realized that someone might come soon, that the neighbors might suspect something. She had to do something to avoid the inevitable punishment. However, her mind couldn't come up with any sensible plans. In a state of complete despair, she grabbed her bag and hurried out of Jason's house, leaving his body on the floor and the knife at the crime scene. There was only one thought in her head: to run away, to hide as far away from this horror as possible. She could no longer stand to be near the body of the man she had killed with her own hands. As she ran out of the house and onto the street, her heart continued to beat wildly. She looked around, trying to see if anyone had noticed her exit, but the street was silent and deserted. Marilyn felt a faint hope that perhaps she could escape and avoid detection. She hurried to her car and, without thinking, got behind the wheel. Her hands were shaking and her eyes were full of fear. She started the engine and pulled out onto the road, trying to drive as fast as possible, but at the same time not to attract attention to herself. She knew that her actions might seem suspicious if she was too hasty, but panic controlled her every move. One thought pulsated in her head: escape, find shelter, avoid punishment. On the road, her thoughts jumped chaotically from one idea to another. She tried to find an answer to the question: where to run, how to hide, who to turn to. But none of these solutions seemed possible to her. She realized that she had nowhere to go. The only person she could talk to was Rebecca, but her daughter, of course, would never forgive her for what she had done. Their relationship was destroyed long before this tragedy, and now, even more so. Marilyn drove aimlessly, with no idea where she was going. Every time she passed other cars, she was overcome with the fear that someone might recognize her or connect her to Jason. She began to fear that the police were already on her trail, even though it had only been a short time since the murder. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that everything was already known, and that she would not be able to escape justice. Her panic grew with each passing minute, and soon she realized that she had no plan. Her mind was clouded. She couldn't think of a single place where she could hide or seek help. A feeling of utter helplessness grew inside her. She realized that her attempt to escape had been a mistake, but turning back was even more terrifying. Any move she made now would only make the situation worse. When she reached the edge of town, where there were no more busy streets or houses, she felt trapped. Her heart started beating faster again, and she realized that she simply didn't know what to do next. Marilyn parked the car on the side of the road, turned off the engine, and, putting her head on the steering wheel, let the tears flow. She couldn't believe that things had gone this far. She had killed Jason, ruined her life, and now she was a fugitive. Her tears flowed without stopping, and in that moment she realized the full weight of what she had done. Her entire life had been destroyed in one night. Marilyn could not even imagine how to live with this burden. She no longer saw a way out, no future. Everything that had once mattered was now ashes. As she sat in the car, the realization grew that she could not escape the consequences. Panic slowly gave way to a deep sense of despair. Marilyn knew that her days of freedom were numbered, and that soon the truth would come out. She knew that running was only an instinctive response to fear, but she could not run from herself, from what she had done. A voice inside her told her that retribution was inevitable. Realizing this, Marilyn decided to go home. She knew what she would do next, but the feeling of complete helplessness had already taken over her mind. Her life had no meaning anymore, and the only thing left was to face the consequences of her actions. While Marilyn was wandering the roads in a panic, desperately trying to escape reality, Jason's house slowly grew quiet. His body remained on the floor, and an eerie calm reigned around him. But this silence could not last forever. Neighbors began to notice that something was wrong. Jason's usually lively house was suddenly plunged into complete silence. No one had seen him for a whole day, and this aroused suspicion among his closest neighbors. A few hours after Marilyn left the house, one of the neighbors, who was always attentive to what was happening in the neighborhood, decided to check if everything was okay. She went to Jason's house, rang the doorbell, but no one answered. The unusual silence made her even more wary, and she took a few steps toward the window, hoping to look inside. The lights in the house were off, but something in the air told her that something terrible had happened. Finding no answers, the neighbor decided to call the police. At first, it looked like a simple check. Perhaps Jason had simply gone somewhere and forgotten to report, but the woman's intuition told her that this was not the case. The police, having received the call, arrived at the house, ready to conduct a routine check. When police arrived on scene, they also found silence and no signs of life. After several attempts to contact Jason by knocking on the door and ringing the bell, the officers decided to enter the house to make sure everything was okay. Once inside, they immediately sensed something was wrong. A kitchen lamp was illuminating a small portion of the room, and on the floor was what they initially thought was spilled liquid. But as they got closer, they realized it was blood. A horrific scene appeared before them. Jason's body was lying in a pool of blood. The knife that Marilyn had used was still on the floor, covered in traces of her thoughtless actions. The police immediately realized that a murder had occurred. Jason's body was already cold, and from its position it was obvious that he had failed to defend himself. The crime scene indicated that it had been a sudden and brutal act of violence. An investigation began immediately. Crime scene experts arrived to collect evidence, and soon detectives were involved. They began interviewing neighbors to find out what might have happened and perhaps get some information about those who might have been involved. Those who knew Jason were shocked by what had happened. No one could believe that a young and vibrant man had been killed in such a brutal manner. However, those who knew Jason and his relationship with Rebecca began to recall strange moments related to his frequent visits to her mother, Marilyn. Several neighbors mentioned seeing Marilyn visiting him often, which raised the investigators' suspicions. More questions arose when they tried to contact Marilyn herself, but she did not answer their calls. This only increased the police's suspicions. Investigators began to piece together the pieces of information they had gathered. It was clear that Jason had died as a result of an assault, and all indications were that it had occurred in a domestic setting, with no signs of forced entry or struggle, suggesting that the killer knew the victim. Police began to look closely at Jason's social circle, looking for clues. Meanwhile, Rebecca, unsuspecting, continued her normal life. Her relationship with Jason was already on the rocks, and she had no idea what had happened that fateful night. When she was told that the police had found Jason's body, her world came crashing down. She was overcome with shock and despair. She couldn't believe that the man she had once planned her future with had been murdered. But the shock became even greater when, as the investigation progressed, Rebecca began to suspect that her mother might be involved in the crime. The investigators began asking questions about Marilyn, about her relationship with Jason, about how often she visited his house. Rebecca remembered the last few weeks when her mother's behavior seemed strange to her, when there were so many inexplicable moments between her and Jason. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't even imagine that things could have gone this far. The police continued to gather evidence. It was only a matter of time before investigators found Marilyn and began questioning her. The crime was already growing in detail, and at the center of this story was a woman whose emotions and passions had gotten out of control. Marilyn, who had escaped justice, was now in even greater danger. The police were on her trail, and she would have to answer for her actions. Thus began the next phase of this tragic story, where the truth finally began to surface, and the consequences of the murder became increasingly obvious to all involved. After Jason's body was discovered, the police launched an active investigation. Marilyn remained on the run, but her situation grew more desperate with each passing hour. Investigators had already gathered enough evidence to link her to the crime. Key testimony came from neighbors who had frequently seen Marilyn near Jason's home during the weeks when their affair was at its height. Even more important were the testimonies of those who knew about the strained relationship between her, Jason, and Rebecca. The police checked her mobile phone records, and on that fateful evening they recorded several calls from Marilyn to Jason, confirming her presence at his home shortly before the murder. The alarming suspicions grew. Everything pointed to the fact that this crime occurred against the backdrop of a heated personal conflict. The motives became increasingly obvious: jealousy and a broken relationship. Marilyn, feeling the circle tightening, tried to hide further. She moved from one small motel to another, trying not to attract attention to herself. But her psychological state was on the edge. Fear, panic, and remorse were eating her up from the inside. Her thoughts rushed between the desire to go back and confess everything or to continue hiding, hoping for a miracle. But it was clear to her. It was impossible to escape responsibility for Jason's murder. Police began searching for her across the state. Local news outlets began reporting on a murder suspect, and Marilyn's photo was shared on social media. She could no longer remain unnoticed. People began calling the police to report suspicious individuals, and soon one of those calls led to her arrest. She was arrested early in the morning at a run-down motel on the outskirts of town where she had tried to hide. The police surrounded the building, and when Marilyn saw cars approaching through the window, she realized that there was nowhere else to run. She did not resist arrest. Her whole appearance expressed deep fatigue and complete moral exhaustion. The police handcuffed her and took her to the station for questioning. During the interrogation, Marilyn looked broken. Her appearance, previously well-groomed and stylish, now showed weeks of stress and fear. The interrogators immediately noticed her nervous state, and her tear-filled eyes betrayed her internal struggle. Her psychological state was unstable, and the police knew that once they began, she would quickly succumb to the pressure. The interrogation began with questions about her relationship with Jason and Rebecca. Investigators first tried to establish context, how her feelings for the young man developed, and what caused the tension. Marilyn initially tried to answer evasively, without going into details, but investigators skillfully led the conversation, building a picture of the events of that fateful night. Finally, Marilyn couldn't take it anymore. Under the weight of the accusations and the evidence against her, she began to speak. At first, carefully, slowly, trying to maintain control of the situation, but then the tears broke through her defenses and she confessed everything. Her voice trembled and her words came out ragged, full of pain and regret. She told how much she loved Jason, how their relationship had gone too far, and how her jealousy and despair had gotten the better of her that night. She admitted that she went to Jason hoping to talk, that she wanted to find a solution, to keep at least a shadow of their past relationship, but their fight became too emotional. She could not cope with her feelings, and in a fit of anger she grabbed the knife. It was a moment she could not control. After the blow, she realized what she had done, but it was too late. The investigators recorded her testimony without interruption, but every step she took was now recorded as evidence of her guilt. Marilyn did not try to justify herself. She knew that after Jason died before her eyes, her life had changed forever. Her confession was the culmination of long weeks of pain, fear, and internal struggle. She knew that a harsh sentence awaited her, and that her actions had destroyed not only her own life, but also the life of her daughter, who was now left alone with this terrible truth. When the interrogation was over, Marilyn had no more strength left to fight. She was in custody pending trial, and she knew that she would have to face justice. Now she had to accept what she had long feared, punishment for what she had done in a fit of uncontrolled emotion. This tragic story had entered its final phase. Marilyn now faced justice, but perhaps the greatest punishment for her was that she had to live with the knowledge of her actions and the loss of Jason's life. After Marilyn's arrest and confession to Jason's murder, preparations for the trial began. The entire city, shocked by the story, followed the developments closely. The story of forbidden love, jealousy, and betrayal that ended in a brutal murder turned into a high-profile trial that was discussed in every home. Marilyn became the central figure in this tragedy, and the trial promised to be the final chapter of her destructive life. For Rebecca, it was a time of unbearable pain. She lost not only the boy she once loved, but also her mother, who was now a murderer. Her life was completely turned upside down. Everyone who knew her family now looked at her with sympathy or condemnation. Her world was destroyed, and she felt betrayed by both sides. Rebecca became one of the key figures in the trial, having to endure public discussions of personal tragedies and the revelation of secrets that no one should know. The trial began a few months after Marilyn's arrest. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Everyone expected the case to produce big statements and details that would finally reveal the picture of what happened. The prosecutor was determined and accused Marilyn of premeditated murder, insisting that her actions were motivated by intense jealousy and a desire for revenge. He demanded the maximum sentence for her. The trial heard all the key evidence, from neighbors who saw Marilyn on the day of the murder to experts who confirmed that the knife found at the crime scene was used by her. The prosecution took a hard line, arguing that Marilyn had acted in cold blood and deliberately. The prosecutor emphasized that this was not an accident or self-defense. This was a murder dictated by emotions that she could not control. Marilyn's defense, in turn, tried to present her actions as the result of temporary insanity. Her lawyer claimed that she was under severe emotional stress, that her psyche was damaged by deep jealousy, fear of loneliness, and internal struggle. The defense insisted that Marilyn did not fully understand what she was doing when she stabbed Jason, and that her actions were not premeditated. Marilyn looked devastated and broken throughout the trial. Her eyes were constantly downcast, and she barely looked at anyone around her. She knew that her fate was now in the hands of the court, and she made no attempt to deny her guilt. During her testimony, she talked about her feelings for Jason, how their relationship had grown into a deep connection that would eventually destroy her life. Marilyn said over and over that she did not want to kill Jason, that it was a moment of loss of control when she could not cope with the emotions that came over her. However, these words could not change the facts. Jason was dead, and this was the result of her actions. It was obvious to many who watched the trial that no excuse could bring him back to life, and for this, Marilyn had to be severely punished. Rebecca was going through a harrowing experience while attending the trial. Her relationship with her mother was forever shattered, and now she had to watch the life of the woman who had once been her role model and support be destroyed in the courtroom. She sat in the bench and couldn't believe that this was happening to her family. Rebecca was torn between hating her mother for killing Jason and feeling lost because she still loved her as a daughter. This internal conflict tormented her day after day. When the trial came to an end, sentencing day arrived. The courtroom was filled with people awaiting the final verdict. The prosecutor insisted on the maximum sentence for the murder, pointing out that the crime was committed with particular cruelty. Marilyn's lawyer, on the contrary, called for leniency, claiming that his client had suffered a deep emotional breakdown. The judge, after listening carefully to both sides, finally delivered his verdict. He found Marilyn guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. This sentence meant that she would spend the rest of her life in prison, with no chance of ever returning to a normal life. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom was silent. Marilyn did not resist or protest. She knew that this was the deserved outcome of her actions. She understood that her love, which at first seemed to her salvation, eventually turned into a destructive force that destroyed everything around her. Thus ended the trial. But for all participants in this tragic story, Marilyn, Rebecca, and everyone associated with them, a new chapter began, full of bitterness, regret, and unbearable pain. The trial was over, but for Marilyn, Rebecca, and everyone else involved in this tragic story, it was just the beginning of new trials. Each of their lives was changed forever. The court sentenced Marilyn to life in prison, but the biggest punishment for her was the realization that she had ruined the lives of those she loved. Marilyn spent her first days in prison in a state of deep depression. Her world narrowed to the gray walls of her cell, and her thoughts continually returned to the night she killed Jason. She had lost everything: her freedom, her daughter, and the meaning of life. Now she would spend the rest of her days alone, wondering how her passion and jealousy had led to such a terrible end. She often sat in her cell, replaying in her mind all the moments that could have gone differently. Marilyn tried to justify her actions, but each time she came to the same conclusion. Her emotions were out of control, and she lost herself in this chaos. Sometimes she thought about Rebecca, about how she betrayed her trust, how she destroyed their connection. She knew that their relationship would never be restored. Rebecca, for her part, was suffering too. She had lost not only Jason, but also her mother. Although her mother was alive, she was behind bars, and their relationship was forever damaged. Rebecca could not forgive Marilyn for what she had done, and she still could not accept the fact that her mother was capable of such a thing. Every attempt to numb the pain was unsuccessful. She could not live with this burden, and this feeling plunged her into a deep depression. Rebecca tried to return to normal life, but everything reminded her of the tragedy. The city where everyone knew her story became a foreign place for her. Her acquaintances looked at her with sympathy or condemnation, and this did not give her peace. She decided to leave, hoping that distance would help her cope with grief, but even in a new city, memories continued to haunt her. Marilyn gradually began to get used to the routine of prison life in prison, but loneliness and guilt did not leave her. She wrote several letters to Rebecca, hoping for forgiveness, but she never received a response. She knew that their relationship was irreparably broken, and this fact tormented her more than any other punishment. She realized that she would carry this burden for the rest of her life. Years passed, but the pain did not diminish. Her inner conflict, the guilt for what she had done, and the lack of forgiveness from her daughter became unbearable. Marilyn realized that everything she lived for had disappeared on that fateful night. She had lost herself in this story that she had once believed in so passionately. Rebecca, too, lived with the eternal shadow of this tragedy. Time had not healed her wounds. She could not forgive her mother for the life she had ruined and the love she had lost. Despite the distance, her memories of Jason and what her mother had done did not allow her to move on. She was unable to create a new life, remaining a prisoner of her past. This tragedy ended not only with the loss of a human life, but also with the destruction of several destinies. Forbidden love, which began with a secret passion, turned into a catastrophe that destroyed everything in its path. Marilyn and Rebecca were left alone with their demons, facing the consequences of what happened every day. A life that could have been full of love, hope, and family happiness was now filled only with pain, regret, and constant reminders of what was lost forever.